In this lesson, we'll look at the importance of whereabouts we hover the cursor when we want to apply specific operations to our viewport selections. Now, I want to extrude these edges around the bottom of the vase outwards to form a base like we have on this reference. We can't extrude geometry using the Edit node. Instead, we need to use the Poly Extrude node, which, like most surface operators, is a procedural node. So I'll just turn off viewport subdivision for now by tapping Shift and the minus key, and I'll double click on one of these edges to select the whole loop. Now, with this edge loop selected, I'll hover my cursor over the viewport, and this is important as we'll see, and I'll bring up the tab menu and select the Poly Extrude node. And now, because I had my cursor hovering over the viewport when I brought up the tab menu, Houdini's automatically connected the Poly Extrude node after the Edit node in the network, and it's automatically added that edge selection into the group parameter field here. So now I can use the extrude handle to extrude these edges out. I don't want to extrude the edges in the direction of the surface though. I want to extrude them in the direction which is perpendicular to each of these primitives. So I can tap the M key to toggle the extrusion mode to point normal, and now I'm extruding the edges in a perpendicular direction to each of these primitives. Let's just look at what happens if we try and add the Poly Extrude node while hovering the cursor over the network editor rather than over the viewport. So I'll just delete this Poly Extrude node, and now with this edge selection active again, this time I'll hover my cursor over the network editor as I bring up the tab menu, and I'll select the Poly Extrude node and hit enter. We see that this time Houdini hasn't connected the Poly Extrude node to the end of the network, and it hasn't added that edge selection to the group parameter field. So whether we choose to hover the cursor over the viewport or over the network editor when we bring up the tab menu is important. It effectively tells Houdini whether we're working with it interactively in the viewport, which is the classic way that we'd work in other 3D applications, or whether we're building a procedural network in the network editor. The workflows are quite different. When we work directly in a viewport, we have this typical workflow of continually making interactive component selections and then applying operations to them. When we're building procedural networks, we don't make interactive viewport selections. The selections need to be generated procedurally. So we don't want this group parameter to be automatically populated with a component selection each time we add a new operator. With a procedural system, we typically enter either group names, patterns, or conditions into the group parameter fields, rather than lists of components as we'll see later on. So the logic's pretty simple. When you're working in a viewport, hover the cursor over the viewport when you bring up the tab menu, and you'll get the behavior which is most similar to other 3D applications. When you're working in the network editor, you want to have the cursor hovering over the network editor when you bring up the tab menu, and that way Houdini will leave the group parameter field empty for you to determine the best procedural method for selecting the components to operate on. For now, we're going to stay focused on working interactively in the viewport, so I'll just delete this Poly Extrude node again. And now we don't have to make the component selection before adding the operator. We can do it the other way around if we want. For example, I'll hit Shift plus the N key to deselect all. And now with my cursor hovering over the viewport, I'll bring up the tab menu and I'll select the Poly Extrude node again. And now we can see at the bottom of the viewport, we get instructions telling us to select the geometry that we want to extrude. So I'll double click on one of these edges at the bottom of the vase again to select the whole loop, and I'll hit enter. And we see that just as before, because I had my cursor hovering over the viewport when I brought up the tab menu, Houdini's automatically connected the Poly Extrude node to the end of the network, and it's automatically entered that edge selection into the group parameter field. I'll just use the viewport handle to extrude these edges out again, and I'll tap the M key to toggle the extrusion mode to point normal, so that I'm extruding these edges in the direction which is perpendicular to each primitive. Now, the position of the cursor doesn't just affect the behavior of adding a node via the tab menu, it affects most hotkeys. For example, let's say we want to remove this edge loop to make the profile straight between this point and this point. We can do that by selecting the edge loop, making sure that we're hovering the cursor over the viewport, and then hitting the delete key. And we see that Houdini's dropped down a dissolve node to remove this edge, which is exactly what we want. I'll just undo that and select the edge loop again. And now this time I'll hover my cursor over the network editor and hit the delete key, and we see that we delete the Poly Extrude node and not the selected edge loop. So hovering a cursor over the viewport when we hit delete will remove the selected components, whereas hovering the cursor over the network editor and hitting delete will remove the selected node. I'll just undo that to bring the Poly Extrude node back. So in this lesson, we've seen how the position of the cursor is important when we're adding operators from the tab menu and when we're using hotkeys to perform operations.